IVM.
The most useful piece of advice I have ever received was a 2-word aphorism. Question everything. Do not take received wisdom for granted. Do not give in to easy, intuitive answers. Ask if the world really works the way people say it does. If there are first principles that you consider non-negotiable, apply those first principles to everything. If people say X is a problem, re-examine X and see if it is really a problem. If people say Y is the best solution to X, re-examine Y. Maybe you will find that a proposed solution makes a problem worse. Re-examine everything. Question everything.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. Before we get into today's episode, a quick word from our sponsor for this week. If you are a lover of art and want to get some art into your home, head on over to IndianColors.com. Indian Colors is a company that licenses the work of top Indian artists and adapts it into objects of everyday use, including wearable art like stoles and kaftans, home decor like cushion covers and table runners, and accessories like tote bags. This allows art lovers to actually get fine art into their homes at an accessible price. And another aspect that I find really interesting is that artists get royalties on sales. Normally, authors get royalties on sales of their books, but artists just get a one-time payment. It's different here. The artists whose work you'll find include luminaries like Sameer Mondal, Vaspo X Waxpo, Dhruvi Acharya, Brinda Miller, Shruti Nelson, and Haren Vakil, whose stuff I really like. Do check it out at IndianColors.com. That's colors with an OU. And use the code IVM20, IVM for Indusbox Media, IVM20 for a 20% discount. Remember, IVM20 at IndianColors.com, colors with an OU. And now, on with the show. The subject for today's episode is Defending the Indefensible. It is a nod to a book with that title by Walter Block, in which Block argues against the received wisdom of the day. I have actually handled some of the same subjects that he does on this show. For example, I had an episode with Manasa Venkatraman on why prostitution should be legalized. Block has a chapter on that. Block was a libertarian, and my guest on this show today is the first libertarian I met in my life, Yazad Jal. Yazad helped run the Center for Civil Society back in the late 1990s, and a few years later came to Bombay to be the CEO of Praja, an NGO that tries to increase the accountability and transparency of local governments. He then went off to the US to do an MBA at Yale, and he since worked as a consultant for McKinsey and IBM. He lives in New Jersey, but he happens to be on an extended visit to Bombay, so I took the chance to drag him into my studio. Now, I first met Yazad a decade and a half ago, and in some ways discovered the libertarian in myself through Yazad. I'd say I was vaguely left liberal all through my 20s, and it was only when I started questioning conventional wisdom, looking beyond intentions and towards outcomes, looking beyond the seen and into the unseen, as it were, that I changed. I look at the world through a prism of individual rights, and the most important word in my lexicon is consent. But that's a subject for another day. For now, I'd like to take you on a journey with my friend Yazad Jal as we have another fascinating conversation about indefensible ideas. Yazad, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Hi Amit, thank you so much for having me on the show.
Yazad, today we are going to talk about 5 indefensible ideas. That is, the concepts we're going to discuss are concepts which, no matter from which part of the spectrum you are, the left or the right, you would react the same way. But when you examine these ideas a little deeper, you'll find that that intuitive response is not quite all there is to it. So what shall we start with?
Let's start with inequality.
Right. Now, inequality is a huge problem these days, right? Because there are so many disparities between the rich and the poor. How can that not be a problem? I mean, it's a classic... there's so much conflict brimming, especially in a country like India, where the rich are so very rich and the poor are, even worse than you and me.
So, I think the real problem out here is the poor, or poverty. And very often when we say inequality is a problem, what we're also saying... without necessarily saying it, the unseen part is we should redistribute income, take some money from the rich and give it to the poor in the form of taxes and so on and so forth. The real problem, however, is not doing that, or that's not the solution. The problem is that why are people poor? And they're poor because their opportunities are being blocked. They are not getting the right kind of opportunities to do what they want to do because there is some kind of government block. There is some kind of rule, regulation. You take it from the very simple ones. If you see people selling fruit and vegetables in the street and the police fella coming and, harassing them, taking their carts away. So that's one example. But as you go forward, the reason why people are poor in India is there is a lack of economic freedom. There's a lack of ways for them to climb that ladder. So it's not there is a gap, and we should focus on closing the gap by redistributing money from one side to the other. We should focus really on closing the gap by making sure that the poor are not encumbered as they are, and allow them to use their opportunities, to use their natural talents and further themselves.
So just to play devil's advocate, there are people who would say that, look, after the 91 liberalization, you actually had the economy opening up more free markets and so on, but what happened was the inequalities increased.
Once again, I wouldn't really focus on inequality, even if it increases. What if you have a very unequal society where there is nobody that's poor? Everybody's middle class, but then there is that 1% that are all billionaires. Now, that could be a very unequal society as well. But you don't have poverty out there. Would you see that as a problem? Or is it just, we don't like seeing people do much better than us, and then this is this envy kind of reaction that we have. And I think that plays some sort of psychological part in this as well. So I don't look at inequality as this great gap that needs to be closed. Even if the gap is there, it's fine. I look at the people at one end of it, and I want to make sure that they do well in life and they get up in life. So helping them, and the best way to help them is to get out of the way.
So let me kind of try and paraphrase that and tell me if I'm doing it accurately. What you're saying is that inequality and poverty are two very different things. And while it may appear that where there's great inequality, there is naturally poverty because here there's that disparity, what you're actually saying is that you might have a situation where the inequality is a lot, but poverty might be much greater in, say, another country or area where inequality is less, but more people are simply poor. And what you're essentially therefore saying is that and a point of view that I kind of agree with is that in 91 the liberalization only liberalized certain sectors of our economy. Agriculture, for example, wasn't liberalized at all, and that is where we have so many of the major problems today.
And it's still not liberalized.
It's still not liberalized at all. There are no markets in agriculture. It's something we've discussed on this show, and if listeners want to listen to it, they can look at past episodes at seenunseen.in. And therefore what the liberalization really did was that the areas in which we liberalized, we did really well, and the areas in which we didn't, we continued lagging behind. And if anything, there is that inequality of opportunity which has left a large part of the country behind. And yes, this country has a major problem, but that problem is poverty per se in an absolute sense. And inequality is not really a measure of it and not something to worry about either.
I agree.
And people typically, when they talk of inequality, they say that, hey, as you pointed out at the start, that the best way to sort this out is to redistribute from the rich to the poor. That this is the size of the pie, let's redistribute from the rich to the poor and we'll be fine. Everybody will be middle class or whatever. There'll be more social justice. What's wrong with that way of thinking?
The first thing that's wrong with that is that you're assuming the pie is static. I would rather look at making a larger pie then look at redistributing it. The second thing that happens is when you have really high tax rates, you stifle innovation. People simply would rather not do anything. There was a time in India where the marginal tax rate was, I think, 97.5%. So if you were in that tax slab, you only got to keep 2.5% of your income. In which case, why work that much more to get that income level? You might as well enjoy some leisure. In a way, innovators would simply say, this isn't a real great place for me to be in. And that was also a time when a lot of Indians went abroad and you saw the brain drain.
But that is something which only again applies to the sort of the upper tier, the people who are already kind of rich or well off enough to, go abroad. Doesn't apply to most of our poor masses, right, who don't have those options.
True, but not necessarily true. There were lots of people from poor areas in Punjab and Gujarat who had some family member in the US and who managed to kind of emigrate. And
everybody wanted to go. So what you're saying is it was a vote with the feet.
Yes.
Not everyone could actually get their feet across the border, but if you had given that option, everybody would have gone.
Oh, yes.
Basically. And a lot of those problems are sort of endemic, and we still see them because, our labor laws don't allow manufacturing to grow at the kind of scale at which it would produce a lot of jobs. Agriculturalists are enslaved in agriculture because you can't sell agricultural land for other purposes. And in fact, you see sort of all the recent mass uprisings you've had in India, as a former guest of mine pointed out on the show, Vivek Kaul. And Vivek pointed out that all the mass uprisings we've had recently are essentially by, if you look at the Jats in Haryana, the Patidars in Gujarat, the Marathas here recently, and all of them are by landowning castes who found that with each generation, their share of the land gets smaller and smaller till it's unsustainable. And there's no exit route because they can't sell it, so it's for non-agricultural purposes. And therefore, for all practical purposes, they can't get a good price for it, and it's almost like dead capital. And therefore, they agitate for more reservations or jobs or whatever. And
you actually bring up a very good point, the point of dead capital. You see it also in the cities, where you see, people who are living in slums, who have squatted originally on what was largely, government land or land that should be for all the people, and they've kind of homesteaded in a way out there. The capital that they've got in those places is also dead capital. And one of the ways we can help the poor is by giving them titles to their small plots that they have, creating some way to, remove the deadness from the capital, giving them something of value. And it's been done in countries like Peru, where it has been a huge success. So instead of having these large slum redevelopment schemes, maybe all we require to do is to give title of the land to the people who are already currently staying there, and then let them decide what they want to do with that.
I mean, they can take a mortgage on the house and start
Correct.
a business and so on and so forth. Our mutual friend Barun Mitra told me a very poignant story once. Like, he had done this agitation in Gujarat for tribals getting land rights and so on, which had succeeded. And after a struggle that lasted many years, a bunch of them got land rights. And guess what's the first thing they did? The very first thing they did was they built toilets for their homes. Previously, they'd never built toilets in their homes because they weren't sure of their homes. They were constantly getting kicked off it, and they'd have to come back, and they were treated like squatters. And when they got the rights, and when it was actually their property on paper, the first thing that did was build toilets. So you see how the incentives change and how that influences behavior, culture, all of that.
Correct. And so they're bettering themselves. You have various side effects. One of them out here was better health. So instead of kind of, pumping money into the healthcare system, simply giving poor people more opportunities helps them. And that's a great story, I know.
Right. So before we move on from this point, I'll just kind of sum it up again, that your point is that, number one, inequality and poverty are separate things. Number two, the kind of policy interventions that you need to target them are very different. Inequality is not your enemy. Poverty is your enemy. And if bringing people out of poverty causes inequality to go up, that's perfectly fine. We should not be looking at that metric. In fact, one rhetorical question I often ask people when I try to illustrate the difference between poverty and inequality is, in which country would you rather be poor, the USA or Bangladesh? And everybody would say USA.
Yeah.
But the truth is that Bangladesh is has less inequality.
Yeah, and in the US, if you're poor, you most probably have a TV.
Right.
If you're living in a slum in the US, it's most probably 2 bedrooms.
Right.
I think I read statistics that are now 15 years old, but 97% of people who are considered poor in the US have a TV, have heating or air conditioning in their homes. So, yes, relatively they are pretty poor compared to Warren Buffett or Bill Gates. But compared to somebody in India, they're well off.
Exactly. I mean, inequality to me is and should be the obsession of the first world. They can afford to worry about inequality. We can't. We got to tackle poverty first.
Yes.
And often the solutions take you in completely opposite directions.
Yes.
If you believe in inequality, go to Bangladesh. And let's move on to our next scandalous subject. What is this, Yazad?
Child labor.
Child labor. So, I mean, on one thing you and I are both agreed, as I think all reasonable people are agreed, that it's horrible when children have to work in fields and work in factories, and it's just a crime on humanity. Children should just have a carefree life, grow up at home, get a great education, blah, blah, all of that. However, the solution to this isn't necessarily banning child labor. A ban on child labor can often be counterproductive. Can you explain to me why that is?
So very often when you ban child labor, what you do is you are closing off an important revenue stream for that family. The family most probably needs the child to work, and without that, they might starve. So what do you think is a better outcome? Having a child working or having a family starve?
In fact, I have some statistics to back it up. Many years ago, Oxfam reported on a situation in Bangladesh where international outrage forced companies to lay off 30,000 child workers. Now, you'd think that's a great thing, outrage forcing, 30,000 child workers to be rescued from child labor. But many of those kids starved to death and many became prostitutes. In fact, a 1995 UNICEF study, and there have been many more similar studies since, showed how an international boycott of carpets made in Nepal using child labor led to between 5,000 and 7,000 Nepali girls turning to prostitution because a better option was now denied to them. So, I think a lot of bleeding hearts often make the assumption that if we just ban child labor, everything will be hunky-dory, kids will go to school, they'll have a happy life. But the point is, if they're working in factories or fields, that's probably because that's the best option open to them, because which parent would really want their kid to work? And if we ban that option, they're probably getting into a worse fate.
Yes, that's quite true. And once again, we find that the problem out here is poverty. And if there are better opportunities, the parents would take them. And we find that also in study after study, that, instead of having one study that was done recently by Professor Mushfiq Mubarak, who is a Bangladeshi, said that one simple way of getting people out of poverty and having families then depend on the main earner was to give the male of the family a certain amount of bus money so he could go from the village in Bangladesh to Dhaka and maybe even work as a rickshaw puller. But that would send back enough money and prevent his children from working.
In fact, there's a 1997 paper which backs this up. It's a paper called The Economics of Child Labor by Kaushik Basu and Pham Hong Wan. Apologies if I don't pronounce that name properly. Where they showed that, quote, child labor as a mass phenomenon occurs not because of parental selfishness, but because of the parents' concern for the household's survival, end quote. And Basu and Wan in this paper coined something which they call the luxury axiom, which essentially says, quote, a family will send the children to the labor market only if the family's income from non-child labor sources drops very low. They continue, the children of the non-poor seldomly work even in very poor countries. In other words, children's leisure, or more precisely non-work, is a luxury good in the household's consumption, in the sense that a poor household cannot afford to consume this good, but does so as soon as the household income rises sufficiently. End quote.
Very true. We've seen studies where, people in the carpet industry in Uttar Pradesh would take their children home once, the main breadwinner got a better job. So these were circumstances for the families where they were forced to send the child to do work outside, and without that, the family would starve. And you've seen this is done study after study after study. So we agree that child labor is not something that is a good thing. But one of the things that we need to do as policy advisors is not to advise on a policy that has a terrible, just stop 1 second. I want you to remember that word.
Intentions, outcomes?
Unintended consequences. So one of the things that we don't see are unintended consequences. And the unintended consequence of banning child labor is increased starvation. And you said, prostitution. So those are worse outcomes.
And not just for the children, often the mother. I think the thing to remember here is that very few parents would want their children to work in a factory. If they're taking that option, it's just because imagine how hard life must be for them otherwise, and imagine what the options to that are. And we often imagine that, look, hey, banning something is a solution. Child labor is bad. We all agree that. Any reasonable person would agree with that. But is banning it the solution if it leads to a worse outcome?
No, it's not. So when we live in a free society, sometimes we have to accept certain things that might not be ideal, or something that, what I call are icky. And child labor is one of those. Prostitution is another thing. But I don't think those should be banned. Those are things that need to be allowed at one level. And you have to accept that the parent is the person who should be making decisions for the child, not an outsider, not the state, not the government.
So let me then, I'm in agreement with you on this, obviously. I've written a column about this, which will be linked at the bottom of my podcast page if you go there. But one question that I genuinely don't have an answer to is that if you're agreed that child labor is bad, and in some places it happens almost on an industrial scale, and that banning it is sometimes counterproductive, then what are the options? I mean, just saying that the answer is that, hey, let's have economic freedom and people will eventually come out of poverty and that will solve the problem isn't really a satisfactory answer anymore at two levels. One, it takes time, and B, we are not going to have economic freedom anytime soon given the state of the political economy. So what is the answer then? Should we in no condition at all ban child labor, or what is the answer to this?
So what we should ban is anything that is forced.
Right.
So if the child is, taken away from the family and forced to work in whatever way, that should be banned, because that is a violation of freedom. But beyond that, I think we think that making a law or banning something is doing something for the sake of doing something. And the best kind of government is one that does the least. So getting out of the way and helping people out of poverty by getting out of the way is the best thing that can be done. It's true that in the short term, it might not seem effective. We might not see results immediately. But in the long term, we see that economic freedom helps. I mean, one example of a country is South Korea. South Korea in the 50s and 60s was as poor, and actually was poorer than India. Today, it's a first world country. So it was within one and a half generations. It's moved from being a country that was poorer than India. It was the Bangladesh of its time. And today it's a first world country. So...
Marvelous. I imagine listeners of this show would all automatically support economic freedom. I mean, that's not in question. It's these issues at the margins which we kind of discuss and debate, which makes it sort of a good time for moving on to our next subject, which is a little less of a social hot button, insider trading. What are your views on insider trading, Yazad? Should it be banned?
No. I think insider trading is basically information giving out to the market. Now, when you have, a market in stocks working well, any kind of information will be taken in by traders and will be used by traders to kind of either buy or sell or hold that relevant stock. We think that insider trading is bad because the person, who is an insider is, maybe it's a CEO or an executive of the company.
Has an unfair advantage. But that advantage lasts for a very short period of time. And even then, once the news goes out, what the person is doing is helping the market learn about that news earlier than the market would have in other circumstances. So in that sense, it's a good thing. The only time when insider trading is not good is when there's a fiduciary relationship. So if, for example, you know certain details and you are the auditor of that company, in that case, if you trade inside, but even then, I don't think it should be criminal. It should be a civil case. I would fire the auditor. So why is it that if say there is company Yazad and the auditor of company Yazad does insider trading as opposed to the CEO of company Yazad, which of course is you yourself, Yazad, then why is the auditor wrong and why are you not wrong?
Because the auditor has a fiduciary responsibility. The auditor is responsible. He has promised to audit and keep, the contract
So it's a contractual thing.
It's a contractual thing. So companies can contractually state that their employee should not trade in the stock. And if the employee does trade in the stock, fire the employee. So that's perfectly legal. It's a private company having a private agreement with an individual. We're talking about not criminalizing this. So, Rajat Gupta, for example, in the United States, getting to hear about those things, what he did, telling his friend about what was going to happen at Goldman Sachs, what he did was very cheap and, degrading. But I don't think he should have gone to jail for that. He should have been fired from the board and most probably not hired in any other boards of companies.
So I'll try to summarize your case. Tell me if I'm summarizing it correctly. Markets basically function on information. That determines supply and demand, that determines the price of a particular stock or whatever. So what you're saying is that insider trading actually helps in the smooth flow of information because the information gets out there faster in the form of increased buys or increased sell or whatever, and the market adjusts much sooner. So it actually reduces the asymmetrical information problem, and therefore it's better to just let it happen because the market is going to account for it anyway. And if you actually kept it legal, then the information would get out there faster and markets would adjust faster. That's what you're saying?
Yes.
Right. Let's move on from there to our next subject, which is hoarding. We don't mean the noun hoarding, the advertising hoardings that you see outside, much as they defile our beautiful city landscape, such as Bombay has, but the verb hoarding, which is, for example, I remember when I was a very young man, when I was in college, the Latur earthquake happened. So a bunch of us wanted to help out, but we weren't sure how to donate our money or whatever. So we bought a bunch of supplies, and there were a group of doctors going in this mobile ambulance whose plan was also just to drive around the affected areas and give treatment as in where they wanted and not go to any central location. So we went along with them and it was very interesting. And I remember we were at one point at a village where almost every building had kind of collapsed, but there was a row of shops was open and the villagers were complaining because the prices at those shops had just shot up massively. Now, how can this be ethical? I mean, all the houses have fallen down, nobody has food to eat, and these people are taking their prices up.
It's supply and demand. Now, when people want more of something, the prices generally do go up. So you have a choice at that point of time. You can either buy the good or not buy it at all. So that choice always lies with the consumer. Otherwise, what you are doing is you are setting prices or restricting the hoarder from selling what he wants to at whatever price they want to sell it. And it actually works out in the market. One example of this recently was also surge pricing in Uber. So when Uber surges the prices, what happens is that other people, other taxi operators who might not want to operate might see the increased price and come into the market. Because without that, what will happen is you won't get the taxi ride. The same way, when prices go up, it's not just the hoarders, it's other merchants might decide to enter the market so that you would have more grain and more supplies, but you would have a higher price for those. And this is also very often a temporary phenomenon. The prices will then go back down after some time. So we make a lot of noise about a temporary phenomenon and a phenomenon that actually helps people. People will get the supplies they want. The other option is people will simply not get the supplies they want. The hoarder might just close shop.
Yeah, and that's the option that people never look at. So, for example, let's say there's that one ration ki dukaan which is still standing, everything else is shut down. Now, the demand has shot up so much that if we sold things at their normal price, like if we sold bread at whatever the normal price was, 10 rupees, 20 rupees, whatever it is, there would be shortages. It would be first come, first serve. If he has 20 loaves of bread, the first 20 families would get those 20 loaves of bread, and maybe they'd ration it over 4-5 days. But there might be another family who is starving, who has nothing to eat. They have an ill infant or whatever, and they need the food desperately, and they would be willing to pay much more for it. But they can't, because it's simply gone. And what setting the higher prices means is that people who want it that much more, who are desperate for it, we will then pay the higher price for it. And again, you took the example of Uber. We had an episode on this in the past as well. My listeners can browse it at seenunseen.in. And the point here is that, like, when Delhi banned surge pricing in Uber, what happened? There were shortages immediately. People were stranded for hours at the airport because they couldn't get a cab. It was first come, first serve at the regular prices. So if somebody wanted to catch a flight at the airport and was willing to pay more, or God forbid if somebody was ill and he had to go to the hospital urgently, too bad, they're stuck. Unless they're lucky enough to be among the first few customers, they don't get it. But governments often imagine that if you set the price for something, magically everything will work smoothly after that.
Yeah, so the unseen part of it is people moving out of the market.
Right.
That suppliers move out of the market.
Right.
You see that, the price is fixed and nobody is going to be able to gouge me. But those people aren't gouging. What they are doing is responding to a market situation. And the response to the market situation gets more supplies into the market. The other option is there simply won't be those supplies. And we don't see people moving out of the market. We only see the price setting, or we only see the gouging. It's important to look behind and see what's happening behind. And when we do that, we find that there are people moving out of the market. There are people who simply, we don't want to be in it. Whether it be taxi cab drivers, whether it be suppliers of basic goods, you would find a shortage when you fix prices. This is true of Venezuela today. This was true of Britain after the Second World War when they did rationing. This was even true in India when we had ration shops all the time. So rationing per se increases and causes shortages, while letting the market deal with it would lead to supplies reaching where the demand is the greatest.
So let me try to explain what you just said with reference to the original hypothetical case that I brought up. I mean, not really hypothetical since this happened, the village where the prices suddenly went up. Now imagine that there's one shop standing in a village where, because the demand has got up so much, the price of bread has gone up from, say, 20 rupees to 300 rupees. I'm using arbitrary figures here. 20 rupees to 300 rupees. What this does is that because price carries information, people from neighboring villages who might have a surplus of bread suddenly feel attracted to come here because the price has gone up, and they know that even if they don't get 300, they'll get much more than 20, and they then rush to this village to make up for the supply shortfall, and therefore a lot of the people who were without bread, they now get served. Now, had you fixed the price at 20 rupees by government diktat, what would have happened is that a few families, the first come first serve, would have got those, the rest of them would not have got any bread, and no one from the neighboring villages would have been incentivized to bring their surplus bread here. So the important thing to remember is that price in a free market carries information, and the moment you don't allow it to function in response to supply and demand, that information vanishes. A very good example of this in the context of Uber would be that because of Uber's surge pricing, drivers who are inactive decide to come on the road because they can make more, and therefore there are less people who go without cars and so on. And this informational function, quite apart from the fact that if you fix prices you'll get scarcity, but this informational function is the unseen effect of fixing prices.
That's right. And very often what also happens is when you have a lot of other suppliers come in the market, the price starts to fall. And the price in your example may not fall, of the price of bread, may not fall all the way down to 20. But it might well fall from 300 to, say, 100 rupees. So you'd see the addition of suppliers helping the consumer. So you're right. The information that price carries is very important. And when we try and throttle that or close that off, we lose a lot more than, we gain.
And you heard both the suppliers and the consumers, as in the case of Uber, where the few taxi riders will get a ride at a price much less than what people would value the ride for.
Correct.
And a lot of people will be stranded. So on the first 4 subjects that we've discussed so far, you and I have been in complete agreement. On the 5th subject, though, I tend to disagree with you. So let's get to that right now. And those are libel laws. I believe libel laws should exist. I'm a free speech absolutist, but nevertheless, if someone, say, Yazad, if someone was to write about you, say I edit a magazine called Pragati, if we carried an article, which, I mean, we don't do that kind of stuff, but if we were to carry something slanderous about you, which led to you losing your job and not getting any more jobs, and it was a lie, it was just a slanderous lie, a malicious one, then you should have some recourse to some kind of civil action against us, some kind of tort. And libel laws allow you to do that, that if someone, hurts you like that, you have recourse to something. But your argument is that libel law should simply not exist. I give you an opportunity. Convince me otherwise.
Okay. Let's start by simply saying that we're going to use the word libel as a catch-all for all kinds of defamation, unless you have a nitpicky person who says that this is slander and that's libel and so on.
Let's use it as, let's say defamation per se.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, now, in this case, why do you think you should have recourse to it? Because you think that your reputation has in some way been harmed, and you want to kind of repair the bad that has happened to your reputation. Let's wait a while and think about what your reputation actually is. Your reputation is what other people think of you. So when you are trying to regulate your reputation, you are trying actually to regulate other people's thoughts. You have a right to your property. You do not have a right to other people's property, and that includes their thoughts. So at a philosophical level, that's the reason why libel, tries to regulate other people's thoughts, and that's why I'm against it. But even on a practical level, there are many problems with libel. Now, you have countries that either have strong or weak libel laws. Now, countries in strong libel laws, the libel laws are massively misused.
Like England, for example.
Or even India. The recent case where I think the Adanis filed a defamation suit against the Wire.in is an example. That suit was filed to harass the Wire. That suit was filed to throttle news. It was filed to silence somebody else. So you see a lot more of that happening, where you're using the libel laws to shut somebody up, to make sure that the press cannot be free. So in that way, libel laws are massively misused. In places with weaker libel laws, what happens is that, people have a lower trust in whatever gets printed. You're assuming just because Pragati prints something about me that could be malicious, people reading it are going to believe that. They most probably might not. In a world with libel laws, what happens is that people may tend to be more believing of a large newspaper. In a world without libel laws, people will simply want to double check and triple check. And whatever harm that somebody's reputation gets is most probably going to happen anyway. The newspaper doesn't have to maliciously print a lie about you. They can print something milder and try and, print rumors or, indirectly allude to certain things. That could also harm your reputation. So beyond a point, it's very difficult to kind of say, my reputation is going to be intact because there are libel laws. That's the fantasy world we're living in.
So let me respond to all of your points, and let me go backwards, starting with the latest point about countries with weak libel laws. Now, Pragati, of course, has an impeccable reputation and credibility. Anything we print about you will be believed, so just watch out. But having said that, I grant your point that if a magazine publishes falsehoods on a regular basis, its credibility gets affected, and in a sense that marketplace where credibility has some currency is in itself a corrective measure. Fine, I'll grant that. As far as your comment on countries with strong libel laws is concerned, I'd simply say that every law can be misused, but that's not really an argument against the laws per se, right? A rape law can be misused. Somebody can file a strong case. That doesn't mean that you don't have rape laws. You need those laws. And for people who misuse those laws, you should have commensurate punishment. But leaving that aside, I want to tackle the philosophical question, because what you said about reputation is absolutely true. You can't control what other people think of you. You can't control their thoughts. However, my objection to defamation isn't that it hurts your reputation. My objection is that it can actually cause harm to your property. For example, let's say I work somewhere. Let's say I'm a doctor. and a newspaper publishes a report, a false report, about how I'm a bad doctor and I've killed people through my, by giving them bad medicine. And then everybody stops coming to me, and I could be earning 3 lakhs a month from my medicine, and suddenly that drops to zero. It's literally a loss of property for me. It's causing real harm to me, which is, and there should then be some recourse to me to get compensation from that, from the party which caused that damage by printing the fake news. Which is why I'd say libel laws are, and by your point about reputation being what other people think of you, but here the issue is not what someone is thinking of me. The issue is my income, my property. I might have to mortgage my house, not be able to send my kids to school, though I don't have kids, and God forbid I ever do. But it'll cause an actual harm to me. So what's your answer to that?
So my answer to that is, I think this is a narrow example, and very often one newspaper writing something about you isn't really going to cause that much of damage to the doctor. The doctor has other recourse. You can actually take an ad out in another newspaper. You can kind of...
but come on. I mean, no, you can't take an ad out. I mean, if you're a regular general GP, you can't take an ad out.
You might be spending much more on legal fees trying to fight the newspaper off. So you have recourse to a variety of different things out here. The first thing to think about is on a practical level, that it's going to be difficult fighting a large newspaper if you're a small person. The second thing to think about is that there are many other avenues, where you can enhance your reputation. And in today's world, there is no one avenue that is going to be so dominant that is going to cause you to lose all your income. I mean, you have Yelp reviews, for example. Just because you get a 1-star Yelp review, doesn't mean that, the business closes down. There could be a lot of other 4 and 5
No, it
star
doesn't.
reviews.
But for example, if Times of India does publish something about a doctor whose patients have lost their lives because of his quackery, while he otherwise actually might be a perfectly respectable GP doing a great job, and he loses all his patients, everything else is an hypothetical. What he has lost is gone. It's actual real damage. Shouldn't someone be responsible for that?
Do you really think that the Times of India is that powerful anymore?
But I'm giving you a hypothetical case.
So my problem with this hypothetical is it's too narrow. But yeah, it might affect some amount of his business. But then, the Times is not the only newspaper that's read in the country. Two, the Times is fluff, really. So not many people take it seriously any which way.
I write a column for them, and weekly limericks. Shame on you. You're calling them fluff.
The limericks are great fun.
I'm not going to buy you coffee after this. You're buying me coffee. Right.
There are a few columns in the Times that are worth reading. That includes yours. But just because something is in a newspaper, again, just because it causes some damage does not mean that you have to have law against that. There are many other things that could damage that doctor's reputation. Another doctor might come out in the same area who might be offering his services for half the price. Now,
of course, but that's all legitimate. And in fact, if the newspaper is right in what it says about the doctor, that's also legitimate.
Correct.
But if it maliciously says that people have died because he's a quack, and that causes him to... let me put it like this. Let's say I could take an iron rod and go to a doctor's clinic and destroy it completely and cause him material damage of X amount.
Correct.
And he could have that same material damage of X amount because somebody spread lies about him using whatever medium. So why, in the first instance, he would be perfectly within his rights to file a case against me because I've damaged his property? So why not in the second instance?
Because in the first instance, there's an act of aggression. In the second instance, you're assuming that just because somebody has said a lie, it's an act of aggression. Unfortunately, when you have a country with free speech, even lies are free speech. And therefore, that malicious lie, I do not consider to be an act of aggression. Because I don't consider it to be an act of aggression, I don't think there should be a criminal case against it or a civil case against it. You can fight it in a variety of different ways. It's very difficult to fight off somebody who is taking an iron rod and smashing your thing, because that person has actually, is harming you physically in an aggressive way. The person writing a malicious lie about you is doing what they can do, is exercising their right to free speech. And I believe the right to free speech has no or very little, if any, encumbrances. And, of course, India doesn't have free speech as we like to think about it. It's highly restricted. But coming back, if we believe in a strong right to free speech, we should also believe that people have the right to lie. I won't go into the intent part of it, whether it's a malicious lie or not. Because a newspaper question is going to say, oh, no, we have sources, blah, blah, blah. And, no newspaper is going to say, oh, that's a malicious lie about that doctor. And if a newspaper is going to do that, their reputation is going to be harmed in the long run. Yes, the doctor's reputation will also be harmed, but the doctor has many things that they can do. And today, with a variety of information sources, there is no one dominant information source. And people get their news, so it's like a massive Yelp market, if you must think about it that way. So yeah, you could have a 1 star on that Yelp, but you could also have lots of 4 and 5 stars. And it's the average number of stars that define your reputation in a way.
Well, I mean, we live in the age of fake news anyway. Everything is false and people believe everything to be true. So I won't get into that argument. We'll agree to disagree on this. But meanwhile, let me sum up the 5 things we discussed today. On inequality, we are both agreed that inequality and poverty are very different things which require different kinds of treatments, and a poor country like us should focus on tackling poverty first. That is our moral imperative. On child labor, both of us agree that child labor is a terrible thing. It is monstrous for children to be deprived of the best years of their lives. But banning child labor may make actually things worse for the children than better. And we should consider the consequences, unintended or unseen. On insider trading, we are both agreed that insider trading should be legal because it reduces the information asymmetry in the market. It helps the information get out there earlier in the market, adjust to it. On hoarding, both of us agree that price controls are bad. Price carry is useful. I mean, A, they create shortages in the short run and price controls. And B, in the long run, they prevent information from getting out. And prices are the bearers of information and perform the vital role in any society, I would say. On libel, we tend to disagree. You feel that libel laws do not need to exist, that lies are a part of free speech. You're a free speech absolutist, as I also claim to be, but clearly I'm not as much as you. And you feel that your reputation is really what someone thinks of you, and you can't control what's in somebody's mind. And you've pointed to the case of libel laws being misused in a country like India, where libel laws are so strong. And your argument is that let there be no libel laws. What will happen is that companies, publications, people will automatically get to a certain level of credibility by their actions and their words, and let that be enough. You can't control somebody's speech. I kind of disagree with you in the sense that I think if speech causes you actual harm to your property, you should have some recourse. But on that let's not let that solitary note of disagreement come between us, and you're buying us coffee after this because you don't want coffee from Times of India money. So thank you so much for coming on the show, Yazad.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being on the show.
If you enjoyed listening to the show, you can follow Yazad on Twitter at Yazad Jal. You can follow me at Amit Varma, AmitVarma. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen on seenunseen.in. Thank you for listening.
The Seen and the Unseen is co-produced by Indus Vox Media Podcasts, and you can check out other IVM podcast shows on their app or website, especially a new one called Akanksha Against Harassment. Hosted by Akanksha Srivastava, this show discusses cybercrimes and how to make the internet a safe place. For one, you can stop browsing and start listening. Episodes out every Thursday.
He bends down to test the warm water for his bath. He comes here to quench his thirst for a hot shower and some podcasts. You can witness how he enjoys having other people talk about cool stuff in his bathroom. Indeed, it helps him with his loneliness. You can find more of his species on ivmpodcast.com, your one-stop destination where you can check out the coolest Indian podcasts. Happy listening.